Kristen Atchison here again, and we're on video 3 of chapter 1, the brain. So here's the image from your book on the brain, and the outermost layer of your brain is called the cerebral cortex, and it has two different hemispheres. So if you look at your brain from this top dorsal view, you can see it has those two sides, and those are pretty much symmetrical, and we'll have similar areas processing on similar sides. So we have the four lobes of the brain are in both hemispheres: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, which is the blue, the temporal lobe, which is the green, and the occipital lobe, which is the pink. So the back of your head, if you put your hands on the back of your head, you're putting your hands on your occipital lobes. If you're putting your hands on your ears, you're putting your hands over your temporal lobes. The top back of your head is your parietal lobe, and the front of your head is your frontal lobes. And you can see almost 3 of those lobes from the bottom ventral view as well. Your brain has 2 different kinds of layers, and we talk about them in terms of matter. So gray matter is the outermost layer. That's where your cerebral cortex is those outermost layers of the brain. And that's really made up of those cell bodies, those soma from the neurons. Whereas the white matter is where we have those myelin-covered axons that connect to other parts of the brain, that connect parts of the cerebral hemispheres, that connect parts of the different lobes. There's a really great video from PhD Comics that I have linked for you to watch called Unfolding the Brain. They also have another one called Your Brain is Amazing that's only about a minute long, and both are really, really good, and I encourage you to watch them. So we use cognitive neuropsychology to understand. This is how we've gotten a lot of our information about the brain, especially before we had imaging techniques. So this is the investigation of deficits, either perceptual deficits or cognitive deficits, in order to figure out the structure of the brain, what parts of the brain carry out normal function. And so when there is brain damage, whether it be for a stroke or a seizure or some sort of lesion, some sort of injury to a part of the brain, that the deficits that occur, those perceptual deficits that occur and those cognitive deficits that occur, teach us something about what that area of the brain did. So again, we talked about these kind of 4 lobes, but I'm going to talk about them a little bit more. Again, that occipital lobe here, it's the blue picture, the blue lobe is on the back of your head. And that really has a lot of your visual information. So your eyes are connected, the optic nerve is connected straight from the back of your eyes all the way back to your occipital lobe. So if you ever hit your head on the back and you see stars, that's why, is because that is your occipital lobe or your visual cortex. The parietal lobe is, again, just kind of up from that on the top back of your head. And this has a lot of your information about touch. That stream that's really towards the frontal section, if you see that gyrus there between the central sulcus, that first yellow gyrus, that's where our sensory cortex is. And again, that has a lot of information about touch there. Our temporal cortex is really easy to remember that this is hearing because it's right behind your ears. And so again, we have a lot of our auditory information is being processed there. We also have information about language as well. Wernicke's area is there. And then our frontal lobe, we don't talk about as much in this class, but it has all of our planning and judgment, and it's really kind of the last to finish developing. So if you think also about the age of the brain, the evolutionary age of the brain, it developed from the back and the bottom. So where you see that kind of brown structure, that is the first to develop, and then it kind of went from the back to the front. So the frontal lobe is the newest evolutionary piece of our brain, and it is one of the last to finish developing in terms of development of our own personal brain as well. And these 4 different lobes really lead us to this idea from cognitive neuropsychology of modularity. And that's the idea that the brain consists of distinct modules, each of which carry out specific functions. So again, the occipital cortex that has our visual cortex, that's the idea of modularity, that's happening in one specific location. Whereas in our temporal cortex, where we have our audio cortex, where we're hearing, that's the idea of, again, of modularity, that's happening in one specific area of the brain. And again, this came out of this cognitive neuropsychology where we saw a deficit in one of these areas, and we were able to link it with that sensory function. We also have subcortical pieces of the brain, and that's everything that's kind of underneath the cortex. So when you looked at that bottom ventral view from your book, which is figure 1.8, you can start to kind of see a little bit more of those subcortical parts of the brain. The most important one of those for this class, sensation and perception, is the thalamus. This is a really important subcortical structure because most of our sensory signals are being passed through the thalamus on their way from the sensory organs to the cortex. So from the ears, from the eyes, these sorts of things are going typically through the thalamus. The other thing that's important to know about the brain also comes from cognitive neuropsychology, and it's the assumption that that the functional organization of cognition and the brain is pretty much the same in everybody. We might have slight differences, but that your occipital lobe is in the same place as my occipital lobe, and your frontal lobe is in the same place as your friend's frontal lobe, and that your olfactory bulbs and your thalamus are in the same places. So again, that they are organized in the same way. Thanks.